First, a disclaimer. This video is not about who should win, or in other words, who is morally right. I only analyze the de facto situation and state what the likely outcome will be without including my own views about the conflict. The conflict in Ukraine is a hot topic, and people usually form strong views. These views often make them subjective in assessing the situation. Supporters of Ukraine will often find clues to prove that Ukraine is winning, and those who support Russia will point to facts that make them believe their side is winning. Often these arguments do not stem from logic and reason but from a bias. They want their side to win and select the facts that make them feel good. I will leave all that aside and focus purely on the situation and the likeliest outcome. Let's see how Russia compares to Ukraine in some key metrics: population, economic strength, and the size of the military-industrial complex. In 2014, Russia had 144 million people, while Ukraine had 45 million. However, the balance shifted further in Russia's favor after it annexed Crimea in 2014 and from 2022 onwards, eastern parts of Ukraine. Now Russia has around 150 million people in all the territories it controls. Ukraine's population decreased not only due to people living under Russian-controlled territories, but also due to the millions, around 6 to 8 million, that fled Ukraine, mainly to Western Europe. Thus, most likely, Ukraine now has between 28 and 32 million people within its current borders. The size of the economy is important because the stronger a state's economy is, the more resources it can invest in military capabilities. Russia's economy is much bigger and more consolidated than Ukraine's. Russia has so many different types of natural resources that it would be easier to list the few resources that it does not possess in significant quantities. Each year, Russia exports a few $100 billion worth of commodities, from oil and natural gas to a multitude of metals or agricultural products. Ukraine inherited a strong industrial base from the Soviet era, but the post-independence economic history is one of stagnation, and the country remained behind the rest of Europe. Finally, the military-industrial complex is an important factor. Russia again clearly dominates due to the formidable weapons industry inherited from the Soviet Union and carefully maintained afterwards. Thus, if Russia and Ukraine would have fought in isolation, without any other country intervening, it is hard to imagine that the Ukrainians could have resisted for too long, no matter the bravery of their soldiers. Let's define the West as most of the EU countries, the US and Canada. There are outliers to this definition. Hungary is in the EU but has often taken a different stance, while Norway is not in the EU but has been completely supportive of the West's efforts to aid Ukraine. The West supported Ukraine in two different ways. First, it offered direct support, large sums of money that kept Ukrainian finances stable. It also sent large quantities of military equipment, from helmets and rifles to ultra-modern air defense missiles and rockets that can strike Russian territory. As direct support, we can also count the training of tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in NATO countries and offering military intelligence to the Ukrainian military. Then the West also aided Ukraine indirectly by trying to hurt Russia economically and isolate it from the rest of the world. The goal of these efforts was to make Russia incapable of financing the war. This included heavy sanctions imposed on Russia and encouraging other countries to cut economic ties and diplomatic ties with Russia. The direct support was essential in keeping Ukraine in the game, but the attempt to hurt and isolate Russia has not yielded the desired results. Russia was hurt by these sanctions, but moderately so. As opposed to countries like Iran or North Korea, Russia is too big and important for the world to be cornered by Western sanctions. Russia plays a role on the global stage that cannot be easily replaced. First, it produces 10% of the global oil output. It is one of the biggest exporters of oil. If Russia were to stop exporting oil, there is no one who can replace them and produce such high quantities. Thus, the price would skyrocket. But oil is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Russian commodity exports. It is the largest producer of natural gas. It produces coal, tens of different types of metals, from gold and platinum to copper, iron and titanium. It is also an important exporter of agricultural products, the most important being cereals like wheat or maize. The agricultural exports are important not only for the tens of billions they bring each year, but also from a strategic point. There is an increasing number of countries that are unable to grow enough food to feed themselves. For these countries, strong diplomatic ties with agricultural exporting countries represent a matter of national security. Critics of Russia often point out that the size of the Russian economy is dwarfed by that of the US or China. This is true, but taken as a single observation, it is superficial. Russia is an important economic partner for many countries. The EU countries, especially Germany, have felt in the last 3 years what it means to be cut off from the cheap Russian oil, natural gas, and metals. A crucial role in maintaining Russia's strength has been played by China. While not directly aiding the Kremlin in Ukraine, when the Western world stopped buying Russian goods and imposed heavy sanctions, China greatly increased its imports from Russia. This move by China has two reasons, one practical and one of a broader strategy. The practical side of it represents simply taking advantage of a situation for economic benefits. China has negotiated with a cornered Russia very advantageous contracts for oil, gas, and other products. Since Russia also diminished its imports of Western products, it largely replaced them with Chinese ones. Thus, China greatly benefited economically from this war. The strategic side of it refers to a larger geopolitical game between the US, China, and Russia. The Chinese believe that the US is deeply concerned by the Chinese rise, and that it attempts to sabotage it by any means. Thus, the calls from the Western world to isolate and put pressure on Russia have been viewed with suspicion. The Chinese believe that after Russia had been weakened, the West would have switched its focus on China. Thus, the hostility towards China and Russia has drawn these two states together. The coupling of China and Russia represents a formidable force that is probably unbeatable because the two giants have symbiotic attributes. Russia has immense natural resources, while China has the workforce and technology. Many in the West believe that the relationship between China and Russia is purely transactional and that, in the future, old points of dissension would reignite a feud between the two. At least in the medium term, that seems highly unlikely. Russia has managed to survive the economic warfare with surprisingly few bruises, and this is a reminder not only of Russia's resilience, but of the fact that the West does not reign supreme over the world anymore. Let's talk about the absolute limit to Western involvement, the nuclear deterrent. The Western world has offered Ukraine all the help it can short of direct military involvement. This is an important observation. Both Russia and some Western countries, US, UK, France, are nuclear armed. If the situation were to escalate to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, it is hard to imagine that a nuclear war could be avoided. Both sides have, until now, been careful to avoid confronting the other side directly. This sets a clear ceiling to the limits of Western involvement. While it could offer more money, more arms, or impose tougher sanctions, there is not much more to do than what it has already done. When we look at the map, we see that Russia is constantly gaining new territory, but at a slow pace. Some people see this as a sign that Russia is failing, but in this specific conflict, slow progress is not proof of failure. It is proof of the attritional nature of the war, which fundamentally favors Russia. This is not a fast-moving maneuver warfare like the early stages of the US invasion of Iraq. This is a war of attrition. In an attritional war, the primary objective is not to gain territory but to systematically destroy the enemy's assets. Their military equipment, their infrastructure, and most crucially their manpower. Territory is only taken as a consequence of the enemy weakening and being forced to withdraw. The fundamentals of this type of warfare greatly favor the side with deeper reserves of manpower and industrial capacity. Let's revisit the numbers. Russia's population in the territories it controls is around 150 million. Ukraine's population in government-controlled territory is estimated at just 30 million. This is roughly a 5-to-1 advantage in manpower. Also, Russia has been able to transition its formidable Soviet-inherited military-industrial complex into a high-output wartime economy. They are now producing massive quantities of artillery shells, drones, and armored vehicles. In this grinding contest, Ukraine is forced to rely on a continuous but finite stream of Western aid to replace its losses. Russia, however, is relying on its own domestic production and a nearly bottomless pool of men to draw from. The longer the war continues under these rules of attrition, the more heavily the tide must turn against Ukraine, whose most precious resource, trained and battle-hardened soldiers, is being depleted at a rate that is simply unsustainable compared to Russia's reserves. The attritional mechanism is a slow, inevitable clock ticking down against Kiev. It is hard to believe that China will abandon Russia for the reasons already explained. The new economic sanctions could make some smaller and weaker countries abandon economic ties with Russia. But if China is determined to keep Russia in the game, it can easily replace the role of those smaller countries in Russian trade. Thus, an economic collapse for Russia looks improbable. However, it is not impossible. It should be noted that sometimes states collapse very suddenly and without giving strong signs beforehand. Another way in which Russia might lose is if the population overwhelmingly turns against the war. Here, once again, there are not many signs of hope for the supporters of Ukraine. While there are signs that the Russians have grown tired of the war, the Kremlin's propaganda has efficiently spread a message to its own population that NATO is aggressive, seeks to expand too close to Russia, and a military intervention was necessary. Ukraine seems to be struggling to keep the territory it has, let alone conquer some territory back. As time passes, the situation grows increasingly dark for them because their manpower resource gets depleted. The longer the war continues, the more territory Ukraine will lose. This is not to say that it is impossible for Russia to collapse and Ukraine to regain some or all of its territory back, but it is highly unlikely. Most probably, Russia will keep the 20% it already possesses from pre-2014 Ukraine and also gain more territory, either through force or through a diplomatic settlement. Who wins and loses is a subjective matter prone to interpretation. Many Ukrainians, including Zelensky, have defined winning as getting all the territory back, getting war reparations, and Putin in jail. From this definition of win, we can say that Ukraine will lose completely. On the other hand, the Russian objective has not only been to conquer the eastern Russian-speaking regions, but also to change the regime in Kiev with a friendly one, maybe even a puppet regime. From this perspective, the Russians will score a partial win, only the territories. While Ukraine is probably never going to join NATO, it is also never going to be pro-Russian in the foreseeable future, so the Russians' win will also not be total. What is sure is that if the war is going to reach an end in the coming months, this will not represent the end of the conflict. The remaining Ukraine will hate Russia for many years to come, and the West and Russia are going to have a very tense relationship. In a sense, the war will only switch to other spheres, diplomatic, economic, cultural, with the potential at the smallest spark to reignite in a hot war. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.